1 year after the most intense earthquake in Japan's history, with the scars of devastation still visible, time remained frozen in that moment. That moment when nature unleashed a crisis that caused the pillars of Japanese society to collapse. 365 days earlier, a magnitude 9 earthquake shook the seabed east of the island of Honshu. The earth roared, and the fury of the seas awoke in the form of a colossal wave. Together, the earthquake and the tsunami caused one of the greatest natural disasters Japan had ever faced. 15,859 people lost their lives, 6,152 were injured, and 2,556 were still missing at that time. But something else happened on that fateful March 11th, 2011. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, operated by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, fell victim to a rage it was not prepared to fight. The earthquake, and especially the tsunami, triggered a series of catastrophic events that left Japan in the hands of an invisible enemy. A cascade of technological failures culminated in the complete loss of control over the plant and its reactors. At the mercy of an uncontrollable radioactive hell, unable to cool their insides. 3 of its active reactors suffered partial meltdowns and 3 hydrogen explosions, along with the release of radioactive contamination into both the air and the sea, turned the Fukushima incident into the second most severe nuclear accident in history, surpassed only by Chernobyl. In the days that decided the country's fate, the radiation emitted into the atmosphere forced the government to declare an increasingly large evacuation zone around the plant. Finally, an area with a radius of 20 kilometers forced 154,000 people to leave their communities, leaving everything behind due to the threat of that invisible enemy. It was not until December that the situation in Fukushima was brought under control that they managed to get the reactors into the much-needed cold shutdown. And although no direct deaths were attributed to the nuclear accident, tens of thousands of people were still far from home. An unsettling silence still reigned around Fukushima. Radiation, like a ghost, continued to haunt what were once its lands. Likewise, with the anniversary of that tragic day and the dismantling process of the plant underway, the information coming from the government and the Japanese press remained unclear. Evacuated residents wanted answers that even after so long, they had not yet received. Everything around the Fukushima incident remained shrouded in secrecy. Understandably, public trust in nuclear energy had collapsed. That triple disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear accident, devastated the Japanese economy and morale to the point that in a country at the forefront of nuclear energy, 2/3 of Japanese wanted to end nuclear power. News that the Fukushima plant used reactors that were over 40 years old and lacked many of the safety measures of modern ones. Along with rumors that plant workers were forbidden to tell what happened inside the plant, set off alarms internationally. In this context, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the state agency, and world reference in nuclear safety, due to the lack of transparency in Fukushima, decided to initiate an investigation. The plant had been designed in the 60s by the American company General Electric, and as such, several US plants had a design very similar to the Japanese one. It was essential to determine why a plant designed to withstand such forces of nature succumbed to them. Thus, an NRC delegate was sent to the capital of Japan to gather all possible information, reconstruct the history of the Fukushima disaster, and present a report on the event that sheds light on the darkness, that restores confidence in nuclear energy. However, all the opacity that was intuited soon became clear. TEPCO, Japan's largest electric company and the 3rd largest in the world, owner of the Fukushima plant, 1 year later still had not admitted any guilt. And above all, it had forbidden the operators who were inside the plant during the days of the disaster from narrating what happened, under the threat of, as was said, losing their jobs. Without their testimonies, all hopes of knowing the story vanished. Fortunately, when it seemed that they were running out of paths to follow, one person, perhaps the most important, agreed to tell what happened. The plant manager himself during the nuclear disaster, considered by many a hero who prevented a much greater catastrophe, Masao Yoshida, was going to give them everything they needed. The engineer had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, unrelated to the incident that past November, 8 months after the start of the crisis. Therefore, he had left his position as director of the plant, and knowing that he probably did not have much time left, he did not want his story to perish with him. In Yoshida, they had the most precious testimony to reconstruct the day-to-day of the nuclear accident that paralyzed the entire world. In him, they had a door to that place. It was time to travel back to that fateful day when the invisible enemy germinated. It was time to return to Fukushima. On the shores of the Pacific Ocean, being one of the 25 largest nuclear power plants in the world, the Fukushima Daiichi plant has been operating as it has for 40 years. Calm and peace reign in its surroundings while the fury of nuclear energy is contained inside its reactors. Until suddenly, the Earth roars. The plant is hit by a devastating tremor. An earthquake like no one at the plant had ever experienced has shaken Fukushima. And despite the understandable fear, all the operators are calm. All of Japan's nuclear power plants are designed to withstand earthquakes like this. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 shut down automatically, programmed to enter cold shutdown in the event of an earthquake. Reactors 4, 5, and 6 are currently under maintenance and are not operational, so there is no change in them. Even so, the tremor was so strong that the national power grid has fallen. The earthquake has destroyed the electricity lines that feed the plant. But not even at that moment do the alarms go off. Like any plant, it is prepared to respond to a power outage. Emergency systems are activated, and several backup diesel generators are started, whose function is to continue circulating cooling water to the nuclear reactors. Because even though they are shut down, they are still incredibly hot and will take a long time to cool down. A time during which water must be supplied continuously so that the fuel rods do not melt. As expected, the diesel engines act as they should, and the shutdown of the reactors progresses correctly. But it was then that unease struck. A few minutes before 3 in the afternoon, a tsunami warning is broadcast by all the media in the country. The entire northeast coast of Japan is on alert, including its plant. Trusting in the safety systems, in the 6-meter-high seawall specifically designed to withstand tsunamis, they believed that nothing was going to happen. But half an hour later, a monster appeared before them. A colossal wave, an immense wall of water was approaching. Overcoming the poor defense of the plant, the tsunami invaded Fukushima, crashing into it. All the facilities of the plant were flooded, and the port area, destroyed by the fury of the water. The sea had devoured them. And it was at that moment that they understood that everything was going to collapse. Stored in the underground areas of the plant, all the diesel generators were submerged underwater, destroyed by the tsunami, and their fuel tanks dragged by the furious waves. Essentially, in a single moment, the plant has lost all its power. They have no way to cool the reactors. They cannot prevent the nuclear fuel from melting. All alarms go off when the operators face the threat of a core meltdown. Without cooling water circulating around the reactor, the core will overheat like in Chernobyl, causing a huge explosion that will spread radioactive material hundreds of kilometers around. In a matter of minutes, they have found themselves facing what could potentially be the greatest nuclear disaster in human history. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Japanese Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, still unaware of the situation in Fukushima, initiates the post-earthquake and tsunami emergency procedures by convening a crisis cabinet. The Japanese government was facing one of the greatest natural disasters in its history. Search and rescue operations are deployed along the entire eastern coast of the island, while the first reports speak of thousands dead and missing. An estimated 562 square kilometers have been devoured by the sea and more than 120,000 buildings destroyed. The magnitude of the damage caused by the earthquake and tsunami remains unclear, but everything escalates when the cabinet is informed of what is happening at the Fukushima plant. Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan receives the news from TEPCO that all the cooling systems at the plant have failed. For the moment, the plant's external sensors have not detected the release of radioactive material into the environment, but everything coming from there is discouraging. The risk of a nuclear accident worse than the one that occurred in Chernobyl in 1986 is real. They are going to enter into decisive hours for the future of the nation. A nuclear apocalypse can be unleashed on Japan at any moment. Quickly, Kan declares a nuclear emergency situation in Fukushima Prefecture, and from the government, an evacuation order is issued for all residents within a 3 kilometers radius around the plant. And although the message is calm, saying that it is a simple precautionary measure, they are very aware of the seriousness of what is happening. When night falls, back in Fukushima, the plant is still without power. The reactors are running out of cooling and above all without operational instruments. They cannot know what is happening inside. They are absolutely blind. Desperate to know the status of the reactors, they improvise a solution. All workers with private or company cars are asked to remove the batteries from their vehicles to be able to, at least, power the measuring instruments. With these batteries, the operators in the control room of Unit 1 are able to power the essential monitoring devices. By just before midnight, they get the pressure readings. The moment when all the worst omens begin to come true. The levels awaken panic. The pressure inside Reactor 1 is double the normal levels and continues to increase. Without cooling, the fuel rods were getting hotter and hotter. In the core, immense amounts of hydrogen and radioactive steam were being created. At any moment, the reactor vessel could explode. If they didn't act, 3 reactors were going to explode. A disaster much worse than Chernobyl that would leave much of Japan uninhabitable for decades. Aware of the seriousness, the engineers know that they must prevent the accumulation of pressure inside the reactors at all costs. And only a desperate measure could help them. He himself informed TEPCO that to prevent the explosion, they had to release some of those radioactive gases into the atmosphere, perform a core vent to reduce its pressure. They were going to contaminate the surrounding air with radiation, but they had to do it, or the reactor, at any moment, was going to explode. It was an unprecedented measure for which they needed the approval of the government, of the Prime Minister himself. Informed of the possible consequences of refusal, Naoto Kan gives the green light to the venting of Reactor 1 at Fukushima. They have permission to release radioactive gases into the atmosphere, but a setback presents itself to them. In the plant's design, no one had imagined that they would have to perform a vent without electricity. The aeration valves are moved by motors, so without electrical power, they would not be able to open, unless the opening was done manually. In other words, someone had to enter the reactor containment building and open the valve with their own hands. Enter that hell and look death in the eyes. Radiation levels in the control room itself were increasing at an unimaginable rate. Everyone already suspected that the nuclear fuel had started to melt, that nuclear fusion had begun. Desperate to find a solution that did not involve sending several people to their death to open the valves, the hours pass, the venting still does not take place, and the pressure in the reactor continues to grow. The nerves in the government due to the inaction of the operators make Prime Minister Khan, who suspected that something was failing, travel to the plant. An external and internal pressure that finally made TEPCO give the order to send a suicide squad. Although they condemned the men who entered that reactor, someone had to open the valves. The future of Japan depended on them opening that gate. Some volunteers volunteered to form that team. They knew they were going to expose themselves to high levels of radiation, but they entered hell, limited to a maximum of 17 minutes inside. The containment building was no longer a place for humans. In total darkness, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, they had to find the valve. Little by little, with their lives on the edge of death, the workers managed to find it, and the reactor can be vented. A thin and whitish column of gas indicates that the pressure inside is decreasing. In that lethal cloud was what they considered hope. The Fukushima operators trust that the worst is over. But that was just a mirage. Because while at the plant, they were already focused on getting water to the reactors to cool them down, and the security forces were evacuating residents within a 10 kilometers radius, the ground in Fukushima shook again. But this time, it wasn't an earthquake. It was a massive explosion. Unit 1 of the plant had just exploded. The containment building had collapsed, and immediately, the radiation near the reactor reached levels 1,000 times higher than normal. The possibility that the reactor core had exploded presented itself as the worst of nightmares. Fortunately, within the gravity, everything seems to indicate that the reactor itself is intact. The accumulation of hydrogen inside the containment building had caused a large explosion, but the core had survived. Radioactive gas had been released, but they had been saved from the true catastrophe. Still, with the concrete building surrounding the reactor vessel collapsed, if they didn't act quickly, the disaster was imminent. With videos of the explosion circulating in the media, the Prime Minister's secretary holds a press conference in Tokyo where he announces that despite the explosion, there is no sign that the reactor is damaged. But all they were doing was hiding the seriousness of the disaster from Japan and the whole world. Because both the government and they were aware that everything was slipping out of their control. The explosion had stopped all efforts to get water to the reactor. It was only a matter of time before the fuel rods melted and that core fusion triggered the disaster. Simulations showed that in the worst-case scenarios, an evacuation with a radius of 300 kilometers around the plant might be necessary. If that happened, the entire city of Tokyo, the most populous city in the world, would have to be evacuated. Its 37 million inhabitants fleeing that invisible enemy. They were facing what could be the fall of Japan. Faced with this threat, he himself ordered a desperate measure that would condemn the future of the plant, but that presented itself as the only salvation for the country. Pump seawater directly into Reactor 1 in an unprecedented attempt to keep the core cool. Immediately, knowing that the water salts would corrode the reactor's pipes and pumps, causing irreparable damage to their plant, TEPCO orders the seawater injection to be stopped. Nevertheless, knowing that behind his decision there were only economic reasons, he decided to disobey the company and ordered his workers to continue with that pumping. For hours, without rest, the containment structure around the reactor is flooded. It is the early hours of Sunday, March 13th. The evacuation zone is expanded to those 20 kilometers radius, and the Fukushima incident is declared an event of magnitude 4 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. At that moment, suddenly the water levels in Reactor 3 plummet. The measures are so low that they suspect that the upper part of the fuel rods is exposed to the air, which would mean the beginning of their fusion. Faced with this situation, a special team from the Japan Self-Defense Forces is sent to the plant with the mission of injecting water and boric acid directly into the core of Reactor 3. The mixture has the ability to absorb neutrons, which slows down the chain reactions in the core, reducing the risk of the fuel going from solid to liquid in the dreaded fusion. But all their work is in vain, because suddenly, the pressure levels in Unit 3 skyrocket. And in a matter of seconds, a deafening explosion larger than the first makes the entire building collapse. Radioactive debris rains from the sky onto the soldiers. 11 people are injured, but miraculously everyone manages to escape alive from their vicinity. A second containment building has fallen, and although again, the reactor is intact, the radiation has skyrocketed. The levels in the vicinity have reached 1,000 millisieverts per hour. A few hours of exposure to such amounts means death. In Fukushima, everyone feels that it is the end. The idea of abandoning the plant, fleeing to save their lives even if they leave it in the hands of the enemy, begins to take hold of everyone. But if they withdrew, 6 reactors and 7 spent nuclear fuel pools would be abandoned. Fusion would be inevitable. A disaster worse than Chernobyl would be unleashed, as 10 times more radioactive material would be dispersed into the air and water. But when he was ready to accept his fate, unable to sentence the hundreds of people working alongside him to death, the Prime Minister initiated a video call with the plant personnel. Informed of the withdrawal plans, Khan begged them not to abandon Fukushima, that the future of Japan and probably the entire world was in their hands. They had to control that hell before it unleashed on everyone. Faced with this situation, TEPCO facilitated the evacuation of almost all personnel. About 800 people leave the area and seek refuge away from the facilities in case the worst-case scenario occurs. But a small team led by him remained close to that hell. A group that would later be baptized as the 50 of Fukushima. The fate of everything they loved depended on them. A few hours later, a drone flight reveals that the water in the spent fuel pool of Reactor 4 is evaporating, and that despite being in maintenance at the time of the tsunami, the rods were still hot and now probably already exposed to the air, with the risk that this also enters fusion. While reports reveal that the radiation exposure rate is up to 400 millisieverts per hour, when a person's exposure should be only 2.4 millisieverts per year, the 50 alert TEPCO that the top priority at that moment is to cool Reactor 4. That same morning, the company and the government planned to use helicopters to drop water on the containment structure and thus assist in the cooling process. The team knew the risk they were taking and the difficulty of the operation. They had to release the water in motion, without stopping completely over a reactor that they would fly over at 90 meters high. Higher up, they would fail. Lower down, they would receive dangerous doses of radiation. The cameras broadcast for the whole world the arrival of the helicopters at the plant and how they released tons of water over reactors 3 and 4. However, the strong winds made the precision so difficult that after hours of performing the aerial operation, there seems to be no significant impact on reducing radiation levels. Aware that they were only losing precious time, the maneuver is stopped to avoid endangering the pilots further. With the need to cool the building stronger than ever, the Japanese government itself orders a special team of Tokyo firefighters to go to the site to introduce water into the fuel pools at all costs. The men, with no experience working in such conditions, had to park the trucks near the sea to suck up water and then extend about 700 meters of hoses to spray the inside of the building. They had been given 60 minutes to carry out their mission. Anything that exceeded that time, even with protective equipment, could put their lives at risk. And in the midst of what they described as a terrifying silence, an unsettling calm surrounded by an invisible enemy that moved among the shadows of devastation, the firefighters managed to complete the mission. And in the hours after their withdrawal, radiation levels at the plant began to slowly but steadily decrease. Little by little, the feeling that the worst was over spread among everyone. They had been living in fear of death for many days. But it seemed that finally, they were controlling that enemy. That Fukushima was back in their hands. By March 21st, 10 days after it all began, power was restored at the plant. Freshwater pumping allowed the pools to be flooded, but the saltwater had already taken its toll on the circuits. The cooling systems, due to corrosion, were no longer watertight. They had stabilized the reactors. They had prevented a catastrophic fusion of the reactors, but more than 11,000 tons of radioactive water had reached the sea. All evidence indicates that the amount of radiation spreading to the ocean and surrounding areas is increasing exponentially, but that it is an inevitable consequence of cooling operations. The situation escalates to the point that when the Japan Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency analyzes the seawater and finds 7.5 million times the legal limit of radioactive particles, the Fukushima disaster is elevated to level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. Until then, only Chernobyl had reached that maximum level of severity. Although the radioactive particles released in Fukushima were only 10% of the amount released into the environment in Chernobyl, international concern about the incident skyrocketed. At the same time, the chief cabinet secretary of the Japanese government informs the people that those who have been evacuated will not be able to return to their homes in the near future, and that it will take between 30 and 40 years to dismantle all the reactors at Fukushima. Public pressures and more than justified criticisms of the handling of the crisis from within the government pushed Naoto Kan to resign from his position as Prime Minister and leader of the Democratic Party of Japan that same month of August. Meanwhile, they continued to work at the plant, pumping water tirelessly until finally, on December 16th, with him already retired due to his illness, they managed to get the reactors into cold shutdown. They had avoided total disaster, but many wounds were still open. Heroes to many, responsible to others, they had plunged into hell to prevent the collapse of an entire society. And although the scars of the disaster that shook Japan that day in March were still visible, with the story of what happened at the plant, they were going to be able to give what many had been waiting for months. Answers. The story of Fukushima had not yet finished being written. After 3 months of exhaustively analyzing the Fukushima incident, examining every last detail of the events that led to the nuclear disaster, the NRC had completed the investigation report. Thus, on July 5, 2012, the Commission was able to present to the world a report that showed that despite the role of tragic chance, there were those responsible behind the incident. All the clues, all the paths, had led them to Tokyo Electric Power Company. TEPCO, the company that operated the plant, did not have adequate risk assessments, realistic evacuation plans, or strategies to control collateral damage in the event of a nuclear emergency. And with Masao Yoshida's story, they had everything they needed to prove it. After World War II, nuclear energy emerged as the precursor to a new era, a huge power that could power entire cities in a clean and seemingly safe way. Japan, poor in natural resources like oil and gas, saw in it a way to stop depending on other countries to generate electricity. Awareness campaigns about a society that naturally feared everything related to it allowed Japan to have 230 million yen for the establishment of nuclear energy by the mid-1950s, beginning to build plants at a faster rate than any other nation in the world. Among them, the Fukushima Daiichi plant. In July 1967, General Electric and TEPCO began construction of a nuclear plant with 6 reactors that combined would generate a total power of 4.7 gigawatts, making it one of the 15 most powerful plants in the world. The crown jewel of a promising future for the nation. When the first 4 reactors were designed, the engineers reduced the terrain by a total of 25 meters. This would allow them to anchor the containment buildings to the rock bed, preventing their collapse in the event of an earthquake, but at the same time, leaving the plant more vulnerable to tsunamis. To respond to this, a breakwater was built to protect it from waves up to 6 meters high. Anything larger would flood the plant. TEPCO claimed it was more than enough to protect itself from any tsunami that hit the coast, but they had found evidence that in 2008, an internal report warned that in 1897, a tsunami with waves 10 meters high devastated the place where the plant was located. TEPCO knew that even though they were rare events, a similar event could happen again. The leaders took note and promised to review the strengthening of the dikes in the future. Finally, nothing was done. But this was not the only anomaly they had found. In 1991, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself informed TEPCO that seeing the designs of the plant with diesel generators in underground areas, a hypothetical flood could leave Fukushima without power if the power grid also failed. As if it were a premonition, in October of that same year, a torrential rain affected one of the generators of Reactor 1, which stopped working due to its flooding. Despite this alert, no measures were taken to correct the location of these emergency engines in 20 years. Later, in 1998, a plant operator found a crack in one of the reactors. When he reported it to TEPCO directors, they asked him to hide the evidence, that they would take care of it. In the face of inaction, the same worker alerted government authorities, who ordered TEPCO to act immediately. Their way of acting was to fire the operator. The Fukushima systems had been damaged for years. If they had been properly repaired, the leakage of radioactive material would have been greatly reduced. TEPCO's negligence in the face of reports of the compromised state of the reactors was one of the reasons why the area was so contaminated. At the same time, in the 10 years leading up to the disaster, TEPCO was informed on 6 different occasions that its defenses against tsunamis were insufficient. The first time in 2002, when they responded that the probability of a sea earthquake causing a tsunami that affected the plant was 0. The second time in 2004, in this case by a government engineering committee. The third in 2006, where TEPCO was forced to simulate the consequences of the impact of a tsunami that exceeded the height of the breakwater. The leaders do not make the results public because, quoting verbatim, providing information about such improbable hypothetical risks would cause anxiety to people. The fourth in 2008, when TEPCO's own engineers asked the top management to review the design of the dikes. Finally, they do not take the recommendations seriously. The fifth, in 2009, again the government warning that their protection would not withstand a wave higher than the breakwater. And finally, the sixth, as if it were a sign of destiny, came on Monday, March 7, 2011, where the tsunami of 1897 is mentioned again. A phenomenon that, if repeated, could cause the collapse of Fukushima. Again, they promised to take note and consider strengthening the dikes. But by that point, it no longer mattered. Because 4 days later, time was going to stop. It is March 11, 2011. At 2:46 p.m., the Pacific Ring of Fire awakens. The Earth's surface moves as the Pacific Plate slides under the North American Plate in a subduction zone 130 kilometers east of Sendai. The Pacific crust is being pushed into the depths. The solid rock twists. Mechanical stress accumulates until inevitably, all the energy is released in an instant. the seabed breaks at a depth of 24 kilometers in the Earth's crust. An earthquake of magnitude 9, the fifth most powerful since records began, crosses the seabed with a force equivalent to 600 million atomic bombs. Enough energy to power the United States for 100 years, discharged in just 5 minutes. When the sensors at the Fukushima plant detect the most powerful earthquake in the country's history, control rods are automatically inserted into the active reactors. Made of boron steel, an alloy of silver and cadmium, they allow what is known as a scram, an emergency shutdown of the reactors. The Fukushima reactors, like those of any other nuclear power plant, are fueled by uranium, an element that naturally fractures. Atoms split in a process called fission, which, as a result, releases energy in the form of heat and neutrons. That release of particles is precisely what constitutes radioactivity. These free neutrons, in turn, when they impact the nucleus of a uranium atom, can induce its fracture. Nuclear fission can be reduced to this chain reaction of fractured uranium nuclei where heat is emitted. But to turn it into that source of energy that powers entire cities, we have to control it. The uranium is enriched, molded into long tubes we call nuclear fuel rods. This morphology ensures that many uranium atoms are close enough together to produce a powerful chain reaction. Contained within a reactor, the fission of the nuclei creates heat that heats water. This, when it boils, turns into steam that rises to turbines that it rotates. These turbines, when they rotate being connected to a dynamo, are responsible for producing electricity, while the steam, when it condenses and returns to the liquid state, returns to the reactor to repeat that cycle over and over again. That is the magic of nuclear fission. Under normal operating conditions, the control rods, redundant as it may seem, control the rate of these reactions. Because of their composition, they absorb free neutrons, reducing the rate of uranium nuclei that fission, and therefore preventing the reactor from losing that delicate balance. A perfect dance in its bowels. When reactors 1, 2, and 3 of Fukushima enter that scram state, what happens is that all those control rods are fully inserted, abruptly stopping all nuclear fission reactions. But although they have entered that state in a matter of seconds, the fuel rods cannot be turned off by magic. The uranium is still incredibly hot. A reactor like Fukushima's needs between 20 and 24 hours of uninterrupted cooling to cool to a temperature below 212 degrees. At which point cold shutdown is achieved and there is no risk of fuel melting. A whole day in which the plant must ensure the arrival of energy so that cooling does not stop. In Fukushima, following the earthquake, the national power grid fails and the plant is left without standard power supply. Obviously, Plan B comes into action, and the emergency supply is automatically turned on. 13 diesel generators begin to supply the necessary energy to maintain the flow of cooling water in the reactors. The plant has survived without problems the largest earthquake in Japan's history. What no one foresaw at that moment was the threat that was germinating from the depths of the sea. When the earthquake fractured the Earth's crust, 400 kilometers of the seabed rose 3 meters above normal level. This colossal force of nature had displaced 100 billion cubic meters of water towards the surface, creating a huge wave that at the moment of its birth travels at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour, almost the same speed as a commercial plane. The tsunami is rapidly approaching the mainland. When the wave reaches the vicinity of the coast, it slows down drastically, but with the bottom becoming shallower and shallower, the wave rises higher and higher. A wall of water 14 meters high has been created. A monster approaches to, shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, unleash all the fury of the sea on Fukushima. Thousands of tons of water flood the nuclear plant. including the underground areas where the diesel generators were stored due to an incomprehensible design flaw in the installation. If they had been in higher areas, the plant would probably have survived the tsunami. But with a seawall lower than it should be and diesel engines destroyed by water, everything has led to the beginning of the catastrophe. All power supplies have failed. The operators are blind and there is nothing keeping the reactors cool. At that moment, Fukushima faces two potentially fatal threats. First, since the scram occurred a few minutes before that shutdown, the fuel rods are still very hot. Nuclear fission reactions have not even stopped completely, so chain reactions can continue and grow exponentially, as they are no longer being cooled by any coolant. That accumulated heat can not only boil water, but also in parallel, it can melt the uranium rods. The fuel goes from a solid to a liquid state, becoming a radioactive magma, and generating the most feared scenario in a nuclear accident: a core meltdown. This meltdown, which refers to how uranium or any nuclear material melts due to the scorching temperatures, leads to a loss of control over the chain reaction inside the reactor, and that lava can pierce the steel shielding of the reactor core, where the reactions occur, and the reactor vessel, the structure that contains the core and the coolant, thus releasing tons of radioactive material. Fukushima is at risk of experiencing a complete nuclear meltdown. Exactly what happened in Chernobyl in 1986, but even more serious. The reactor 3 alone contains 88 tons of uranium that could be spread by the air. In Chernobyl, only 8 tons were released, and reactor 3 is just one of the 6 that could melt down. Second, beyond the risk of meltdown, the plant is exposed to another danger. The fuel rods are coated with zirconium, a metal widely used in reactors for its low neutron capture rate, so it does not slow down fission reactions but does protect uranium from excessive heat, something important in a healthy reactor. But in a poisoned one like Fukushima at that moment, zirconium becomes a dangerous enemy. At very high temperatures, much higher than operational ones, zirconium becomes highly reactive. Without coolant flowing, the metal exhibits that property and reacts aggressively with water vapor. With temperatures already reaching 2,800 degrees, half the temperature of the surface of the sun, zirconium separates hydrogen from water molecules, which results in a dangerous accumulation of hydrogen gas, a substance that, unlike water vapor, is highly flammable. A simple chemical reaction is creating a bomb inside the reactors. Essentially, Fukushima is exposed to both a meltdown of the nuclear reactors and an explosion due to the accumulation of hydrogen gas, the latter being the most immediate threat. A few hours after the start of the crisis, the pressure inside the reactor vessel is so high that TEPCO orders the venting of it, a desperate measure to air the vessel and prevent the core from exploding that they believe to complete successfully. But what they did not know is that that hydrogen, poisoned by radiation, was already escaping on its own. The hydrogen is leaking through tiny holes in the dome that closes the vessel, and is designed to open when the fuel rods need to be replenished. But it is through it that the hydrogen escapes from the reactor and mixes with the air in the containment building. Its high flammability, in contact with the oxygen in the air, means that it is only a matter of time before it releases its fury. Any spark can ignite the fuse. And on Saturday, March 12th at 3:30 in the afternoon, the bomb explodes. The hydrogen gas accumulated in the upper parts of the containment building of Unit 1 combusts, and the first of the 2 explosions that the plant would experience occurs, both caused by that accumulation of hydrogen. The explosions release radiation into the air as they are caused by volatile elements from the reactor itself. but do not affect those reactors. Only the containment buildings are damaged. Far from the worst of the scenarios that could have been fulfilled. If the hydrogen had not been released through the ventilation that the operators requested from the government, and even if, due to that unforeseen error, the gas had not been filtered through the vessel into the building, the explosion could have germinated inside the reactor itself. And there they would be facing a nuclear disaster without precedent, as all the fuel would be released. It was clear that the workers made the right decision. The ventilation, which they had to do by manually opening the valves, prevented a much more severe catastrophe. Thanks to their actions, a complete meltdown like Chernobyl was prevented. After the fire in Containment Building 4, the one from Reactor 2, in addition to 5 and 6 which remained inoperative, was the only one that did not suffer any damage, but ended up being the focus of another threat, a leak of radioactive magma. The explosions in the adjacent buildings damaged the base of the reactor, and the partial meltdown took care of the rest. With the fuel rods melting from the heat, the most dangerous material in the world germinated inside. Corium, a material similar to lava formed by the fusion of nuclear fuel, has formed inside Reactor 2 at Fukushima. For the third time in history, after the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl accidents, that radioactive magma has been created. Corium, at temperatures of over 2,500 degrees, makes its way through the 14 centimeters of steel of the reactor, oozing to the base of the concrete vessel around it. A leak that condemned the cooling water that they would later inject to cool it to be contaminated by radiation. Every day, hundreds of tons of radioactive material, with particles capable of damaging and destroying living tissues, were inevitably poured into the sea. In total, they estimated that about 300,000 tons of contaminated water had been spilled into the Pacific. In Fukushima, therefore, contamination of the environment had come through 3 channels. The necessary ventilation of the reactors to prevent them from exploding, the explosions of hydrogen gas accumulated in the containment buildings, and finally, by that contaminated cooling water that returned to the ocean carrying the poison of corium. 2 weeks later, power returned to the plant, and the cooling of the reactors continued until that December 16th, when the workers achieved a definitive cold shutdown. Stable at around 70 degrees, it was physically impossible for nuclear fission reactions to start again. With that, their report ended. The investigation of the Fukushima disaster was closed. In the hands of all those who wanted to immerse themselves in the moment when time stood still. One month later, with the publication of the report and the discovery of the negligence perpetrated by TEPCO, the Japanese government initiated the procedures for the partial nationalization of the company. An injection of capital of 1 trillion yen, approximately around $12.5 billion, prevented the electric company from collapsing. After all, the total dismantling costs of the plant were estimated at over $100 billion over the nearly 40 years that the operation was expected to last, scheduled to be completed in the year 2051. During this time, radioactive waste will continue to be generated and must be effectively managed. The radiation inside the reactors remained at around 20 sieverts per hour, enough to kill a human in a matter of minutes. It will be a long time before the levels reach safe ranges for the location and extraction of nuclear fuel. It was not until October 12, 2012, a year and a half after the disaster, that TEPCO would admit to having committed irregularities in the design of the plant and in the handling of the crisis. The executives confessed to not taking the necessary measures in the previous years out of fear of lawsuits and public protests. Meanwhile, the workers who were at Fukushima during those endless days faced an uncertain future. None had died of radiation poisoning, but more than 100 people at the plant were exposed to doses that increased the risk of developing cancer in the medium or long term. Later, on July 9, 2013, came the news that Masao Yoshida had died of esophageal cancer that he had been diagnosed with years earlier. The plant manager during the Fukushima nuclear disaster was remembered as the hero he proved to be. Many bowed to him out of respect for his leadership and the decisions he made when everyone was paralyzed by fear. It was certain that without Yoshida, the catastrophe would have been much worse. He, along with the 50 at Fukushima, risked his life to save the country from a harrowing fate. More than 1,000 people attended his funeral to pay him the tribute he deserved. In 2019, more than 50,000 homes near the plant remained uninhabited, 8 years after the residents were forced to leave them. Similarly, even after so much time, the consumption of fish in the vicinity of the area was still prohibited to protect people from the persistent radiation that had entered the food chain. To mitigate the effects of radiation, the contaminated water from the plant was stored to prevent it from spreading to the environment, and an ingenious cooling system, with an ice barrier that keeps the ground around the plant frozen, prevents groundwater from coming into contact with radioactive material. After many years of spreading the message that the Fukushima accident did not result in the loss of any human life, the government finally confirmed a radiation-related death. A person for whom there is no information died 4 years after the accident from lung cancer linked to exposure to radioactive material. To this day, however, we know that although not directly, Fukushima did take the lives of many. It is estimated that as a result of the traumas, stress, and depression experienced by evacuees, more than 2,200 people died, many of whom, unable to process the pain of leaving their homes behind, decided to take their own lives. The fight against this invisible enemy persists. There is still a long time to go before we can say that we have won the war. But even when that moment comes, when time starts flowing again, something will have remained. The ghosts of Fukushima will never leave the memories of that day when time stood still.